August 19, 1942. Dieppe, France. The shingle beach crunched under boots as Canadian soldiers stumbled from landing craft into a storm of machine gun fire. Concrete bunkers overlooking the harbor erupted with muzzle flashes. Artillery zeroed in on the approaching vessels before they'd even touched shore. Within 6 hours, nearly 4,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The Germans had turned the port into a killing ground, and the lesson was brutally simple. You couldn't capture a fortified harbor by frontal assault. Before we continue with this extraordinary story of engineering audacity, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, whether it's Manchester, Montreal, or Melbourne. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive. Now, let's dive deeper into how one man's supposedly impossible idea changed the course of the war. As the last Canadian survivors withdrew across blood-stained water, Allied planners in London faced a catastrophic realization. Every major port from Cherbourg to Calais was now a fortress. Hitler knew the Allies needed harbors to invade Europe. He'd made certain those harbors would become death traps. And in that moment, staring at casualty reports from Dieppe, the strategic equation became impossibly clear. Without ports, there could be no invasion. Without invasion, there could be no victory. Unless someone could invent a harbor that didn't exist. 3 months before Dieppe proved him right, Winston Churchill had fired off one of his characteristic memoranda to Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations. The Prime Minister's language was typically blunt. Brooking, no excuses. Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. Churchill wanted floating harbors prefabricated in Britain, towed across the English Channel and assembled on enemy beaches. Harbors that would rise and fall with the 20-foot Norman tides. Harbors that could handle the same cargo volume as major ports. And he wanted them within 2 years. The reaction from the engineering and naval establishment ranged from polite skepticism to outright derision. Senior Admiralty officials pointed out the obvious problems. The English Channel was one of the roughest stretches of water in the world. Storm waves regularly exceeded 20 feet. How exactly were floating structures supposed to survive that? The channel floor was sand and soft chalk, nothing to grip for anchors. A functional harbor needed miles of breakwaters, multiple piers, roadways capable of handling tanks and fuel pipelines. You were essentially talking about building several complete ports and somehow dragging them across 100 miles of open water while the Luftwaffe tried to sink them. Military engineers were equally dismissive. Concrete structures that large would crack apart in heavy seas. Steel pontoons would buckle under the weight of loaded lorries. The tidal range meant your piers would need to somehow compensate for vertical movement of 20 feet twice daily. One engineer calculated that the concrete alone would require more cement than Britain produced in a month. But Churchill had learned something from the Great War that the engineers hadn't quite grasped. Modern warfare wasn't about what was theoretically possible according to peacetime engineering standards. It was about making the impossible happen because failure meant defeat. Dieppe would soon prove him catastrophically right. Captain John Hughes Hallett watched the Dieppe disaster unfold from a headquarters ship offshore. He saw men die on beaches because they couldn't get past harbor defenses. He watched the Wehrmacht demonstrate precisely how they'd defend every port in France. And he reached the same conclusion as Churchill. The Allies needed to stop trying to capture ports and start building their own. His first decision was to ignore every military engineer the War Office offered him. What he needed wasn't men who understood how harbors were supposed to work. He needed people who could imagine how they might work under impossible conditions. His first recruit was Bruce White, a civil engineer who'd spent his career building docks in South America. White was initially convinced Hughes Hallett had gone mad. Floating concrete structures weighing thousands of tons. Impossible. But then White started calculating. Concrete didn't have to float in the traditional sense. It just needed to displace more water than it weighed. Hollow concrete caissons, properly designed, could be as buoyant as ships. There was only one way to find out. White signed on. Next came Alan Beckett, whose claim to fame was designing the floating pier at Weston-super-Mare, a seaside resort town. Beckett's pier allowed pleasure boats to dock despite the Bristol Channel's enormous tidal range. His solution had been ingenious. Floating roadways connected to shore by flexible bridges that could articulate up and down with the tide. Hughes Hallett saw immediately how this could scale up. The team expanded rapidly. Railway engineers who understood how to build roadways that could flex without breaking. Naval architects who understood how ships behaved in heavy seas. Harbor masters from Liverpool who could explain the practical realities of cargo handling. What made the team unusual wasn't just their diverse backgrounds, it was their willingness to abandon conventional thinking entirely. They needed breakwaters that could be deployed in days rather than decades. Find, sink massive concrete boxes and link them together. They needed piers that could handle tidal movement. Build them on telescoping legs that could adjust their height. They needed to anchor structures in sandy seabeds. Design massive cruciform anchors that could be screwed into the channel floor. By early 1943, Hughes Hallett's unconventional team had transformed Churchill's absurd vision into actual engineering drawings. The project received its codename, Mulberry. Now came the harder part, building the bloody things. The centerpiece was codenamed Phoenix, and it represented the most audacious concrete engineering project ever attempted. These weren't delicate structures. They were floating fortresses. The largest Phoenix caissons measured 204 feet long, 56 feet wide, and 60 feet high. You could stack 6 double-decker buses on top of each other and still not reach the top. Each one weighed approximately 6,000 tons when complete. They were concrete boxes the size of office buildings that needed to float across the English Channel, then sink themselves precisely into position to form breakwaters. Bruce White's team calculated they'd need 212 of these caissons in various sizes to create effective harbors. The engineering challenges were staggering. Ordinary concrete would crack under its own weight in structures this large. The caissons needed to be hollow to float, but those hollow chambers had to withstand wave impacts generating pressures of several tons per square foot. White specified a mix using blue lias limestone aggregate denser and stronger than standard concrete. The walls varied in thickness from 2 feet at the top to 7 feet at the base, creating a tapered structure that could better distribute stress. Inside each caisson, a labyrinth of internal walls provided structural reinforcement while maintaining buoyancy. Some caissons even included anti-aircraft gun positions on their roofs. They were defensive structures as well as harbor components. Traditional harbor breakwaters were built in place over years. The Phoenix caissons had to be built in dry docks, floated out, stored temporarily, then towed to France. White's team developed a construction process that was part shipbuilding, part civil engineering, and entirely unprecedented. Each caisson took roughly 6 weeks to complete, with concrete being poured in continuous shifts around the clock. The buoyancy calculations were terrifyingly precise. Each Phoenix unit needed to float high enough for stable towing, but low enough that its center of gravity remained below the waterline. Get the ballast wrong, and a caisson could roll over in rough seas. Every caisson would have a crew of 6 Royal Navy sailors aboard during the tow, operating pumps and praying the concrete walls held. Building 212. Phoenix caissons required transforming half of Britain's coastline into the world's largest construction site. The Admiralty requisitioned every available dry dock from Scotland to Cornwall. Construction sites sprang up along the Thames estuary, in the Solent between Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight, along the Clyde in Scotland. At peak production, 16,000 workers were laboring on Mulberry components. These weren't all specialized engineers. Most were ordinary construction workers pulled from other war projects and told they were constructing something. The secrecy was absolute and deliberately confusing. Workers at one site might be building Phoenix caissons while being told they were constructing coastal defenses. The Thames sites alone required 75,000 tons of cement, 14,000 tons of steel, and employed 5,000 workers operating in shifts around the clock. Floodlights illuminated night shifts, carefully shielded so German bombers wouldn't spot the activity. Welders worked through winter freezing, their torches sparking in the darkness. Each construction site became a small city. Workers needed feeding, housing, and transport, and teens served meals around the clock. Medical facilities treated inevitable construction injuries. Several workers died during construction, crushed by cranes, drowned when caissons were floated out prematurely. Their deaths were kept secret. Their families told vague stories about industrial accidents. The most extraordinary sight was at Stokes Bay near Gosport, where the Admiralty had created a purpose-built facility for Phoenix production. 6 massive caissons could be built simultaneously in specially excavated dry docks. Once complete, the dock would be flooded, gates opened, and tugs would carefully maneuver the massive structure out into the Solent. By June 6, 1944, every component was ready. The invasion had begun. And on June 7, D-Day +1, the first Phoenix caissons began their journey across the Channel. This wasn't a single convoy, but a massive coordinated maritime ballet involving hundreds of vessels executing the most complex towing operation ever attempted. Each Phoenix caisson required at least one ocean-going tug, with the larger units needing 2 or even 3 tugs working in tandem. The towing speed averaged a glacial 1 to 2 knots. The crossing took roughly 18 to 20 hours in good conditions. Navigation presented extraordinary challenges. These weren't streamlined ships, they were massive rectangular boxes being dragged sideways through currents and waves. The English Channel's notorious tides could run at 3 knots or more, easily overwhelming a tug's ability to hold course. Convoy commanders had 2 time departures to catch favorable tides and constantly adjust for wind and waves. German E-boats still operated from channel ports, looking for easy targets. What could be easier than a concrete box moving at 1 knot? The Royal Navy provided destroyer escorts, but protection was never guaranteed. Several caissons were strafed during the crossing, bullets sparking off concrete while crews huddled in interior chambers. Tow cables, despite being steel hawsers thick as a man's arm, could snap under the strain. When a cable parted, it whipped back with lethal force. Several caissons broke loose and had to be abandoned, drifting as navigational hazards. The loss rate was factored into planning. Not every Phoenix unit would make the crossing intact. As the first caissons arrived off the Norman coast, the real engineering challenge began. 2 harbor sites had been selected. Mulberry A would serve the American beaches at Omaha. Mulberry B would support British and Canadian forces at Arromanches, a small village east of the invasion beaches. The assembly process began with positioning the outer breakwaters. Phoenix caissons were maneuvered into predetermined locations using underwater markers placed by divers in the nights following D-Day. Each caisson had to be sunk in exact alignment with its neighbors, creating a continuous barrier. Once in position, valves were opened and chambers flooded in sequence. The massive concrete structures settled onto the seabed with surprising gentleness. Inside the emerging breakwaters, the whale piers were being assembled, perhaps the most ingenious component of the entire system. Alan Beckett's peacetime design had been scaled up into massive floating roadways supported on telescoping steel legs. Each pier consisted of steel pontoons linked together to form a roadway 80 feet wide and up to a mile long. The pontoons floated on the surface, secured to the seabed by massive steel legs telescoping tubes that could extend or retract as the tide rose and fell. The Norman coast had a tidal range approaching 20 feet. The telescoping legs allowed this vertical movement while keeping the roadway level. At the shore end, the piers connected to flexible bridges that articulated with the tide. Sherman tanks were already rumbling across the completed pier sections at Arromanches when the weather forecasters noticed something disturbing. On June 18th, barometric pressure began dropping across the channel. What followed over the next 3 days would provide the ultimate test of everything Hughes Hollett's team had designed. The tempest arrived on June 19th with a violence that caught everyone unprepared. Wind speeds exceeded force 6, gusting to force 8. Wave heights built rapidly, reaching 15 to 20 feet. The normally gray-green channel turned into a seething mass of white water. Mulberry, the American harbor at Omaha Beach, started failing almost immediately. The Americans had opted for lighter construction to speed deployment. Their Phoenix caissons were somewhat smaller than the British units. Now those decisions came home with brutal force. Waves began washing over the breakwaters rather than being stopped by them. The whale piers, designed to handle normal wave action, were now being subjected to forces far beyond their design limits. Steel pontoons buckled and broke apart. Telescoping legs bent and snapped. Sections of pier roadway broke loose and were flung onto the beach like toys. Liberty ships that had been safely moored found themselves being battered against the concrete caissons. By the time the storm abated on June 22nd, Mulberry was effectively destroyed. The Americans made the pragmatic decision to abandon it entirely, cannibalizing whatever components could be salvaged. It was a devastating blow. Weeks of construction, thousands of workers' labor, and millions of pounds reduced to twisted wreckage. Meanwhile, at Arromanches, Mulberry was surviving. Not intact, the storm damaged plenty of components, but the core harbor remained functional. The British over-engineering that had seemed excessive during planning now proved its worth. Their larger, heavier Phoenix caissons rode out the storm with relatively minor damage. Within days of the weather clearing, cargo was flowing through Arromanches again. Engineers worked around the clock repairing damaged pier sections. The salvageable components from the wrecked American harbor were towed to Arromanches, adding capacity to what was now the sole artificial harbor serving the Allied armies. The statistics are staggering. Between June 7th and the end of October 1944, Mulberry handled over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. That's more cargo than passed through the port of Dover in an entire peacetime year. At peak efficiency, Mulberry was unloading over 7,000 tons per day. More remarkably, Arromanches outperformed every captured French port. When Allied forces finally took Cherbourg on June 27th, engineers found exactly what intelligence had predicted. The Germans had demolished everything. The harbor was unusable. It took weeks just to open one berth and months before Cherbourg approached anything like normal capacity. Meanwhile, the prefabricated harbor at Arromanches, built from scratch on an open beach, was handling 90% of the logistical requirements for British and Canadian forces in France. Traditional amphibious assault doctrine said you couldn't sustain large forces without capturing ports. The Mulberry Harbours had just proved that doctrine obsolete. You could create ports wherever you needed them, which meant defensive strategies based on fortifying harbors had become largely irrelevant. The Germans had spent years turning French ports into fortresses. The Allies simply bypassed them and built better facilities from prefabricated components. It was engineering defeating strategy, logistics trumping firepower. Arromanches remained operational until well into autumn 1944. Finally being decommissioned in November as captured ports were restored and the front lines moved east. By then, it had served far longer than the 3 months originally anticipated. Some Phoenix caissons remain visible off Arromanches today. Nearly 80 years later, permanent monuments to engineering audacity. They're scattered along the seabed, partially exposed at low tide. Enormous concrete blocks that still seem impossible. Relics of the moment when Churchill's absurd idea became the engineering triumph that helped win the war. 16,000 workers had built the impossible, and 2.5 million men had marched through it into history, carried on the back of concrete dreams that refuse to sink.